Hello, everyone, and welcome to Just DAO It, the podcast for people starting DAOs. I'm Adam Miller, and I'm your host. Really excited to have two awesome guests on the show today, Lutz and Jessica from Aragon, one of the OG DAO projects, and we will get into so much more about what Aragon does and what they're up to. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the CEO and co-founder of MyDAO, which provides legal entity solutions for DAOs based out of the Marshall Islands. And prior to MyDAO, I worked on technology for DAOs. We are recording live. Later today, we will publish this to our podcast feed. As always, the first half of the show will be the Just DAO It News Report, where the three of us go over recent DAO news stories. I will summarize them for our guests and for the audience, and then we will all get to react. What do we agree or disagree with, or what is our take on the story? And then in the second half of the show, we will do a more in-depth interview with Lutz and Jessica about Aragon, about DAOs, what's going well, what's not going well in the world of DAOs, advice for people starting DAOs, and other fun DAO-related topics. But first, let's do some quick intros with each of you. So who would like to go first and introduce yourself?
Jessica, why don't you go ahead first?
Sure. I'm Jessica, and I lead communications and marketing at Aragon. I've been with the project for a couple of years and just very excited to be building technology that has revolutionary potential and that helps people organize differently. It's been an interesting ride, and we're just learning every day. Anthony.
Yeah, I'm Anthony. I'm the CEO of Aragon X, which is really the development and product creation arm of the Aragon project. Been at Aragon for 3 years now, just over. So it's been a little while. And yeah, I think we're here obviously all of us are here to change the world in some capacity. And as more of this world moves on chain and into like a more transparent sphere, it needs to be governed. Governance is, but the practice by which we make decisions, and we're here to make sure that everybody has the tools they need to govern properly. So yeah, I'm super excited to be here with you, Adam, and ready to chat.
Awesome. Love it. All right. Thanks, guys. And Aragon so when I got into DAOs for the first time, which was late 2021, a couple of the first things I came across were just by chance. One was Aragon as the leading DAO DAO tool of the time, and maybe likely still. And two was actually Bankless DAO, which I joined and has been one of the DAOs I've been most involved in, although we are coming up with a new name and a new direction. All right, let's turn to the Just DAO It News Report. So again, I will go through each of these articles and then we will react. So the first article of the week is from CoinDesk. It's an opinion piece. And the headline is, although I'll warn you, I don't think the article is really about what the headline says, but the headline is DAOs need a vibe check. The subtitle is, a recent token heist at Compound DAO revealed the weakness of current DAO governance voting. There is a better way, say the authors. All right. So even though the headline of the article is DAOs need a vibe check, which we could discuss, vibes are important to DAOs. I think actually DAOs are still doing vibes pretty well for the most part compared to traditional organizations and tend to care a lot about vibes. But this article is about a story we've been covering for the last couple of months where in Compound DAO, there was what some might call just a normal day-to-day proposal to allocate some of the Treasury's funds to this new yield-generating protocol. And then others called it a governance attack because of the nature in which the proposal was carried out. And clearly there was something somewhat subversive going on here in terms of people trying to pass a proposal when no one was paying attention, not going through the traditions of the DAO, which would involve posting more to the forum, getting people's input, making sure that everyone had the chance to weigh in on the proposal. But rather, they kind of in a sneaky way got this thing passed. And then it went into a whole conversation about canceling and then maybe moving forward again. And so it created a bit of some drama and conflict within the DAO. But what this article actually goes on to talk about in particular is decentralization metrics. And this question of like, what's the quality of the governance or the voting of this DAO? And do whales get in the way? And because I think one of the things that came out of this compound situation was, are whales a problem, right? What was there, like a whale or a group of whales that pushed through this proposal and the community didn't really have a chance to react? And the article goes on to actually propose a new way of looking at and measuring how decentralized is a DAO. And actually goes on to suggest that whales are not necessarily the problem for the following reason. So if you look at a DAO, for example, that has, and I don't think this was necessarily what happened in Compound, but let's use it as an example. If there was one whale and that whale pushed through a proposal and didn't have the level of resistance that the community might have hoped for, what if there had been 3 other whales? Maybe those whales actually would have counterbalanced the first whale. And so maybe simply saying whales are bad is not the way to look at it. But in some ways, having a lot of well-balanced whales might be the solution. And in particular, not just whales, but voting blocks. And so this article goes on to talk about something called voting block entropy, or VBE, which they call vibes. Now I realize that's where the headline comes from. And the idea with voting blocks is, okay, let's not just look at whales, let's look at blocks of voters that tend to act together. And so in the Compound case, it wasn't just one voter, but it was a bunch of wallets that collectively were acting together. And if you have enough of these voting blocks and they're actually well distributed, that might actually be positive. And one of the results of that idea, implications of that idea, is actually to allow, is a positive argument for delegation. Because if you just have a lot of individual voters, those individual voters are not necessarily acting as a counterweight to blocks or whales. But if people gather their votes together by delegating into what effectively becomes a number of larger blocks, or almost like whales if they're individual delegates, that actually provides that level of balance that can lead to better governance in the long run. So I know that's a lot, but I just want to get your reactions on any of that, whether it's Compound, whether it's this, I don't know if you guys had heard of this voting block entropy thing. I think it's a new idea, but thoughts on whales, Compound, voting blocks, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big topic, right? I mean, look, at the end of the day, I think the Compound scenario is a scenario where you have a project where the leadership of a project, I think we've gotten past the stage of like thinking DAOs don't need leadership, are just no longer really participating or weren't really a part of it anymore. And that leaves this sort of open gap. And this gap and this space needs to be filled by something. And if there's money, like somebody's going to fill that space potentially to try and get this money. So it's a huge topic. What is a governance attack? What is not a governance attack? And we could go on for hours just discussing that. The voting blocks, sort of discussion makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, it definitely mirrors what we already see in more traditional styles of governance in the normal world. I mean, where you have parties and people then, basically vote within the party and what these parties sort of push as their agenda. And this sort of makes sense. And people start to align together to try and reach what, sort of goal that they're looking for. Delegates to some degree are almost, one could say, like a necessary evil at this point in crypto, where it's just, there's so much voter apathy that by just having voter participation seems to be a net positive, which I don't know how I feel about. I do think it's gotten a bit out of control, where like delegation and delegates have become just sort of a thing on their own, where they often don't have skin in the game, they're not incentive aligned, but they're there to provide a service. And so I think that there's a lot to take out of the Compound governance attack, or not, whatever you want to call it. And I think there's a lot we can learn. But I think fundamentally the root problems are around proper incentive alignment, which leads to voter apathy. And these are the root core problems. Everything else is just a mask. Like delegation is just putting a band-aid on the issue that voters aren't voting. So you try and get more votes by having people who don't vote give their vote to somebody else, and so these are just all band-aids. And what we really need to start looking at and fixing is like the root problem is like, why aren't people participating and why aren't they voting? And I think a lot of the reality comes down to people don't have the capacity to participate in governance as frequently as they might require, or is required, or being asked of them. And what that means is I think the problem you have now is you have the most people who are the most engaged are the people with time. And most of the strongest technical founders, product developers, visionaries in our industry are building projects and doing things and don't have time to participate in governance across the space. And so the gap and the void is being filled by people who do have time, or who have made it their goal to have the time to provide this service, whether or not they're aligned. So I think we need to get like much deeper at the root of the problem, start to fix the incentives, and I think, you know, like it's something we're definitely focusing on, right? Like again, delegation has been added across the board across Aragon products too. It's sort of like table stakes now, but we're working on things like gauges, VE mechanisms, lockers and stakers, where people actually are incentivized to participate instead of delegating, and that incentivization comes from doing work. And that's providing liquidity. It's things like this. And that's where their voting power goes. And this is sort of the next stage. We're already seeing it. Like we have a lineup down the street of DAOs who want to build through this gauge methodology, because it creates this incentive alignment rather than just, you know, trying to put a bunch of band-aids and hope it lasts. And one last thing quickly is like Compound's been around for a long time, right? Like there's a clear indication that older DAOs, if they don't continue to have extremely strong leadership, are susceptible, and Aragon as well has been susceptible to this. And so it's something that we all need to be aware of, that we have to continue keeping the alignment moving forward over a long duration of time. And DAOs are very young, so it's very unproven, and this is just another example.
So DAOs like Compound, Jessica, I don't know if you want to comment on this or something else. I mean, any DAO that was created 3, 4, 5 years ago is probably due for a refresh, right? I mean, the technology was so new at that time, and the mechanisms and the techniques and the politics in DAOs. Don't DAOs like that need to just do a bit of a refresh in terms of everything from their core technology platform, at least consider if it needs upgrades, to their voting mechanisms and these other things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think adaptability just generally needs to be planned out, or part of the planning when you're going on an endeavor like this. And it's very hard to kind of imagine that the governance model, or the way that you put things out in the world at a certain time, especially in a space that moves and changes as fast as ours, will stay the same. The tricky part is, you know, with the immutability of smart contracts and the blockchain, et cetera, you kind of need to build that in the technology and in the system. So a lot of these older DAOs built on these original DAO frameworks are kind of stuck or locked into their governance models, because these smart contracts are hard to adapt and evolve. They're just kind of there's a lot of code to review, to change, and they're high risk in terms of adapting. So that's actually one of the challenges that we've been addressing with the next generation of our DAO framework, Aragon OSX, is to allow DAOs to adapt more easily and more securely, whereby isolating the governance logic, you can actually plug in different governance models over time, and actually plan that out as you're launching a DAO, like this ability to evolve with a more kind of like secure methodology. Because I don't know that anyone at this time can say, oh yeah, this is the one model that will work, or what's holding today is going to hold tomorrow, in a month, in a year, in 5 years. That's certainly something that we've learned at Aragon with the journey that we've been on.
Awesome. So I know we're already getting pretty deep into some of these topics, but I actually want to continue double clicking a little bit. I think you both mentioned something called Gauge. I'm not sure I'm familiar with that. What is Gauge? How does that play into DAOs?
Sure. Yeah, it's just it's a methodology for voting, basically. So it was invented by Curve on Aragon, and then it's been repicked, and it's quite a complex system. Basically, people have to lock or stake their tokens into what's called a VE contract, a voting escrow contract. And actually, they're in the Curve situation. They lock for up to 4 years, and their voting power decreases over time, right? And then they can use this voting power that they have locked in this in this locker, and then they have this set of gauges. And in Curve's example, basically there's a bunch of options of where you can vote, basically to allocate your token liquidity, for example, and you get rewarded back for that. And people who are not participating in this actually often can be inflated out or don't receive these rewards, etc. So it really incentivizes you to participate in governance, and the governance is directly related with the incentives that you're going to get back. So this creates this incentive alignment. It creates like a direction for voters to head in. they get directly rewarded for participating. It sort of got expanded on by Aerodrome and Velodrome recently, which is great to see. And now, sadly, I can't mention the names, but in the next 2-3 weeks, we'll have two major DAOs, including the first roll-up to ever use a VE mechanism with gauges. But instead, basically, we've reversed the methodology. So instead of having like a 4-year lockup with like a decreasing voting power, it now you can set perma locker where you could, unstake at any time. But the longer you stay involved, the more your voting power increases. And then, of course, these gauges go up. And this is where these roll-ups or these projects want to incentivize you to participate and vote, and where to direct rewards, right? Everything right now is about where are we directing emissions, where are we directing rewards, where are we directing points, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, now the voters get to actually choose where they want to allocate their voting power amongst many different options that might suit them better. So this is, it's been around for a long time, but it really hasn't caught on until now. It's starting to explode, and it's definitely the next step in governance. There's no question.
So are gauges just for situations where you have a protocol with a small number of, or some number of configurable parameters, and you want to basically focus the DAO on voting on those parameters? Or is it also used for more generalized decision making? Like I'm thinking about let's say a socially oriented DAO focused on community and events or something like that. Could you use a gauge structure to help make decisions about where to hold an event, how to fund an event, what other things to do with your treasury?
We think so, actually. We think so, Adam. Like, we think that this is probably a really great methodology to start expanding beyond just liquidity and incentive direction. Like, we do believe, like, look, okay, let's take an example. You have a grants program, and 10 projects get through the first layer where they make it into the grants program by the grants committee, and now they're here. And so now there's $100,000 where you want to direct this money as a DAO, right? So in gauges, you could have all 10 projects up on a list, and people can now direct their voting power across these different gauges to direct where they want to incentivize or send that grant money. And the great thing about gauges is you can distribute your voting power and break it down. It's not just like a yes or no. I guess it could be, but it's basically, I want to put 50% here, I want to put 30% there, I want to put 20% there. So we really do believe at Aragon this probably could expand beyond. And what's great about this is it's governance. It minimizes governance overhead. And I think that's one of the biggest problems you have right now. If you want to go participate in a DAO or some big DAO like this, it's basically becoming a full-time job, and that's why delegates exist who have the time, right? And so it's very difficult to have the high context to be involved in all to participate, and it slows down these DAOs, right? DAOs, and designed as such, are often very, very slow. Still have decentralized decision making, but be more effective and more efficient. Well, reduce the overhead in some cases. It's not for everything, but you can reduce the overhead in a lot of cases and have these gauges as examples of where voters can vote, be incentivized, or direct where things need to go in the DAO very cleanly and quickly.
Yeah, I love that thought that I'm having, that forces you to prioritize as a voter. Like you just cannot, like if you only have so much voting weight to go around, then if there's a lot of proposals at once, you can only vote on, you can only put your weight towards certain ones, or else you get less weight. And so it's kind of like an incentive to slow down a governance process, which I think can be healthy in some situations. If an organization wants to prioritize and only do so much. Another really interesting thing that's come up here is this idea of like, who is voting and how do the incentives impact whether the right people are voting? So for example, you mentioned, I think the reality of the situation is that people are only going to participate if they have time. Therefore, you're kind of disincentivizing the busiest people who might actually be the best people to be voting if they're the most active, the most successful, the most experienced, however you want to look at it. You might actually be disincentivizing those people from participating in a way, just because it takes time. So it's interesting to hear that you're working on mechanisms for rewarding participation. I wonder how we get around that. I mean, it feels like in life, you could probably break down like resources at a really high level into like time and capital or something. And like, how do we get away from that? Like, the fact is, people who have time are going to be more involved in stuff. And that seems like just a reality of life.
There's also like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction, but along with that question, there's also just the fatigue that comes with the kind of like repetition or with the amount of demands when you're expected to like proactively vote on proposals kind of continuously. It's kind of like the privacy kind of updates or notifications or like cookies policy. You see, you know, it was a big kind of issue and it was like people need to be aware. But when you go on every single website and you're expected to like click your privacy settings or select them, you just kind of like glaze over and you don't pay attention. Yep. You know, so when you have like a high number of demand or high volume of demand, it also like that friction can really get in the way. So these more, like Anthony was mentioning, like minimal mechanisms where you allocate your voting power once to these gauges, or also methodologies like optimistic governance, where proposals maybe pass optimistically, but there's an opportunity to veto, where there's like less overall strain and less overall demand on not only people's time, but people's attention as well. And like the friction that we're putting users and community members through.
Yep. Really interesting. All right, let's finally turn to the next news story of the week. I'm kind of cheating with this one because this is a post from Aragon announcing your new product, but I want to read it and give you guys the chance to talk about the new product and the new announcement. So this tweet is from Aragon Project, and the tweet is: gasless voting on chain. A new solution for Ethereum mainnet DAOs to vote on chain for free is here. This milestone marks a significant leap forward for on-chain governance, enabling DAOs to offer secure and gasless voting, leveraging cross-chain execution with Layer 0 core. I won't read the whole tweet thread, but I want to just read this outline of what it enables for DAOs. Vote from any EVM chain. Gasless voting via Paymaster integration, seamless dedicated UX, unified cross-chain execution, modular and composable design, bridge, chain, and Paymaster agnostic. DAOs can integrate the solutions of their choice. So I want to start with, first of all, very exciting. It's just super, I was on a call I do every Thursday called Let's Talk About DAOs on Farcaster. We were all talking about this and trying to dig into it and figure out exactly what's going on and how it works and who's tried it. Really exciting. One of the things we were wondering, it makes it sound like almost like your DAO can live across all the chains. Is that accurate, that you can live everywhere at once? Or are you still, if you're a DAO using OSX, are you still picking for some purpose, like a main chain where certain things have to like happen or settle to, or can you really, for example, can you have your governance token on any chain and it all gets aggregated for the purposes of voting when the vote happens?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So you basically, like, I guess it depends what you define as the DAO, of course, but like there is some type of central hub, but you're right. Like you can basically start to have tokens across a plethora of different chains that are EVM compatible, and you can basically vote from those chains. It gets aggregated and then it executes not just on one chain, it can execute across different chains as well. So you really do get this like more seamless experience. With this particular version, it's really good in terms of like this sort of multi-chain aggregation, as I said. The downside is that you do need to bridge your token if you want to vote gaslessly to ZK Sync. And the reason we chose ZK Sync was because of the account abstraction. You can have a paymaster, and basically you can have free voting for your voters, but then your DAO on mainnet can execute there. And I thought for us, actually, that's just one value proposition that we thought was worth sharing. It's actually a whole web of multi-chain governance that has been enabled. But we thought really like the most important thing right now is you have these mainnet DAOs, and actually Cassis is cheap right now and people still don't want to pay to vote, right? And so you have all these DAOs moving off chain, which is just not okay for moving towards the future. We need more secure, transparent methodologies for governing ourselves. And we'll talk about Snapshot in a moment, but Snapshot even, recognizes that, and they're starting to move to on-chain governance as well. And so this version of our multi-chain voting plugin, really what we wanted to sell here is like, yeah, have your mainnet DAO. like have all those assets on mainnet where you want them to be really, really safe. If your voters want to vote on mainnet, they can. But if they want to bridge their token to ZK Sync and pay for free, they can. If they want to move it to another chain, they can vote there as well, and spend a penny and vote there as well. And it all gets aggregated, and then it gets sent back. Something else we're working on, which I think is going to be even more exciting, is we're really working with storage proofs and ZK proofs, particularly with RISC-0, to enable multi-chain voting as well. But you don't even need to bridge the token at that point, because you're actually you're proving that these tokens are in a certain location, right, off chain, and then you're able to execute on chain. And so this really opens up a much better and trust minimized experience without the bridging required, which is super exciting. So we think they're both excellent. They both have positives and negatives. Obviously, as every trade-off, there's a trade-off in everything we build in this industry. But this is the first step. Like, we now have truly gasless voting for mainnet DAOs all on chain. That is official, and we launched it a few weeks ago.
Jessica, what are you most excited about in this new announcement?
Well, we were just talking about voter participation and how important that is. And when you don't have voter participation, or when you have extra friction for people to participate and vote, how that can become a challenge for DAOs on so many different fronts, including security, et cetera. So I think, in our view, like, having a frictionless experience for DAO voters and DAO members should be table stakes. That said, there is like a long journey to getting there, to making voting on chain just completely seamless for users, where it's seamless in the UI. They don't need, like Anthony was mentioning, to bridge tokens. They can vote from any chain that their tokens are on, etc. We want to get to a stage where users, and I think that applies to like so many different areas too, to building on chain, where the experience are as familiar as like any app that you'd use in your day-to-day life. So it's really exciting as a really positive and impactful step in that direction. And every step towards decreasing friction for DAO members, whether that's eliminating gas costs or other types of friction, is just a really positive step forward for participation generally and for the space as a whole.
For sure. I want to ask you guys about one of the somewhat technical components of this, if you're comfortable speaking to this. So I was not personally aware that like cross-chain messaging and like cross-chain interactions were really there and like ready for prime time. Like and I'm hearing about you guys, I'm hearing about some other projects doing this. Is this something that's just table stakes now that you can definitely do, and you can definitely trust that you can message that one chain, for example, can know what definitely happened on another chain pretty recently? Like, is that a solved problem? It sounds like by layer 0 that just like for sure works now. Are we putting our trust somewhere that maybe still needs to be earned in the long run? I mean, what's the status of like cross-chain messaging and bridging? Is it really that much farther along than it was maybe a couple of years ago?
Yeah, I definitely think it's come a long way. I think it's pretty secure now. I mean, there's always like bridging, bridges are always the ones. Li-Fi recently got hacked. Wormhole had one of the biggest hacks in Ethereum history. Although they were, some time ago, but it's definitely improved. The decentralization of layer 0 has improved as well with their V2, which is great. And you can sort of control that yourself by participating in the network. You have some great projects like Hashi and Glacis that have also come out that are like that are adding some value to this. So I think we're there, and I'm pretty confident of that. I think where it gets very, very challenging is, how does this then become a very clean, user-friendly experience for DAO participants, voters in the community? That's really challenging, especially from like a UI perspective to the contracts, because everybody has something that they want that's quite particular, or you know what I mean? And we need to build that flexibility. It's why we launched an entirely new DAO framework. Like, this hasn't been done before. Like, Aragon OS was the first DAO framework in 2017. Right? Then came along Open Zeppelin Governor, which added the ability for delegation, and that became popular because people didn't want to pay to vote, right? So they wanted to then delegate, right? And then we've come to a realization after speaking with all those DAOs about 2 years ago that they're all stuck in these very monolithic builds. You basically, as a DAO, have to go fork the entire build, rebuild it all, launch it, maintain it, etc. So we said, okay, this isn't going to scale as well, and it's certainly not going to scale beyond the wealthiest DAOs that can spend 6 months custom building and paying for this, right? So we built a framework that was flexible, and this is where we had to start from ground zero again, and it basically separates the DAO logic from the governance logic. So now you have plugins where you can plug in different methodologies for governance, and this means that the surface area of code that you need to touch is very low if you need to make changes. That makes it more secure, cheaper to work with, and you often don't need audits, because if a plugin, a type of governance, and it doesn't have to be just governance, if it's multi-chain voting, that's a plugin. So here's the amazing thing. Anybody can now go, they don't need to fork the code base or anything. They can go and take that plugin, they can install it into their DAO, and now they have multi-chain governance. And as you mentioned there, one of the cool things is it's actually bridge and chain agnostic. So now if somebody does actually want to use a different bridge, let's say they want to use Hashi, they can then go take that plugin, and they only need to change about 5% of that code base before it's already functioning for them, and they don't need to fork and rebuild the entire DAO, make changes, and then have all that audited. So now you start to get like a governance marketplace. You start to get like actually somewhere where there's a scalable solution for DAOs, small DAOs, medium-sized, big DAOs, that can take types of governance that have Lindy on them and run with them out of the box for a very low cost. So this is what goes back to what you're saying. It's like, are we ready yet? I think we're starting to get ready, because we've fixed that base layer of flexibility, which now means that all these DAOs who have something custom they want to tweak, they want to change the voting parameters, they want to do this or that, they want to do this chain to that chain, now can be done much more easily on Aragon. And that's what we needed to fix first. So I think the messaging's there. The next big thing that we are working on, and Snapshot are also working on too, is obviously storage proofs and ZK proofs for voting. And this opens up some other things that we can talk about momentarily as well, which is really cool.
Okay, interesting. Yep. Well, it's a similar vein of conversation. I want to share the next story of the week. And again, maybe cheating a little bit here, because I'm going to do a story about what I think is one of your biggest competitors, and see if you're willing to weigh in on what's going on there. So the story is from CoinDesk, and the headline is Snapshot, popular DAO voting platform, finally moves on-chain atop Starknet. Snapshot X, the new governance protocol, makes use of storage proofs, which you just brought up, a cryptographic feature that Starkware, the primary developer of Starknet, helped innovate and embraced. And I want to read the first paragraph here too. Snapshot Labs, developer of an off-chain voting platform used by 96% of decentralized autonomous organizations, including those overseeing leading DeFi projects Lido and Aave, is adding a blockchain-based option built on the Ethereum Layer 2 network Starknet. Anything you have to take issue with here so far? Is there anything in the article that you're uncomfortable with, or does it sound accurate? And just curious what your reaction is to the announcement from Snapshot.
Yeah, I mean, we love the Snapshot team. I mean, we have never looked at them as competitors per se, because they didn't do what we did. They do signal voting, which is off-chain. And Aragon helped fund them in 2018 with a grant, actually, in one of the first Ethereum grant programs. So, and guess what? Some DAOs, Aragon DAOs, use Snapshot for signaling before their votes. So like, to say Lido and Aave use Snapshot is true. They go there and they do some signaling, but everything is governed fully on chain by Aave and Lido, and Lido uses Aragon for that. So the other thing is that Snapshot X is more of a voting protocol, you could say. It's not a governance protocol per se. It's not a governance framework. And the cool thing about this is that Snapshot X can plug into Aragon OS X, our DAO framework, and be the voting plugin that people can use to have modular, voting capabilities on a modular DAO framework. Snapshot X requires either Safe, which is not a DAO framework, but is a vault, Aragon or Governor in order to function. So to some degree, they're competitors, but to some degree, they're not. And we really like the team. We think they're good people. And we're super happy they're working on-chain stuff now. Like, we need to move people on-chain, and that's our goal, is to make the pie bigger. We're very disinterested with like competing with some of our competitors in the space, because I mean, the pie could be endless. We could have the whole world governing on-chain, and that's what we should be focusing on, for sure. So I don't take any problem with what they're saying. They need to boost their numbers, and they need to do a great job, and they're great people. As for their solution, I think Snapshot X is great. It's using Herodotus, and there are always trade-offs, right? And that's what's important to note. So like Herodotus is, uses storage proofs, not ZK proofs. And this means that it sends the verification on chain and then you compute on chain with that balance, that voting balance, right? So this has, positives and negatives. And the negatives are that it's more expensive for bigger calculations, and they also can't aggregate the proofs. So for scaling, this could become a problem. I don't think it's a problem now, but it could become a problem, right? And then the second thing is, how does this work, fluidly in the UI? Because the great thing about storage proofs and ZK proofs is that you start to get some of the flexibility that you get off chain, right? With building your census. And this is why Snapshot was so successful, because it's all off chain on a back end. Endless possibilities. I mean, it's completely flexible. You can do whatever you want. You can create any voting census. It can be done in minutes. And that can, and off you go. Like, it's super easy. This is not easy on chain. Building on chain from off chain is a totally different ball game. And so they've entered a space that we're really where we focus on and where we work, and we're happy to see them there. And what we're working on something different than them. We're working with Risk Zero, so the competitor of Herodotus, and they have some benefits as well. Basically, the opposites is, as I mentioned before, it's a much more scalable system. And so some of the cool things that will be opened up, and we've received a grant from Optimism to build this, is that with using Risk Zero in Aragon, you remove the need to bridge to vote, which is great, right? You allow any type of token to vote. This is also super important, and why Snapshot off-chain has been so successful. You didn't need an ERC20 vote standard token to vote. You just needed an ERC20, or really almost any token to vote, because if it's not ERC20 vote standard or a mini-me token standard, you don't have on-chain governance capabilities. So what do you have to use? You have to go signal voting off chain. So storage proofs and ZK proofs actually remove this need. So now we can start to have ERC20 vanilla DAOs that accidentally or decided not to have, voting capabilities on their token. Now they can actually start to participate in on-chain governance, right? So other things we get with the builds that we'll have out for Optimism soon are it preserves delegation when you bridge across chains, which is super cool, right? It automates the dispatch of votes, and you get back to gasless voting. You can now start to have gasless voting, which is what we really, really need. So I think I'm glad Snapshot are working on that. We're working on the same thing. We're doing it a little differently and with just what we think is a better solution. Yeah, we work with them, and we're happy to keep working with them.
Awesome. Yeah. One of the things I was trying to bait you with a little bit was just the line that 96% of DAOs do off-chain voting. And I think
they're not DAOs, is what you want me to say. You want me to say they're not DAOs. You won't say it. Look, you know my opinion. I'm a bit of a hard head when it comes to what is a DAO and what is not a DAO. Lido is a DAO. They govern everything on chain. They use Snapshot to do some signaling to see what gauge people's sentiment. And I think Snapshot's a very powerful tool for that. And I think it's great that we have that kind of solution. But you know me, like, I think that DAOs need to eventually, and yes, progressive decentralization is fine, but need to be on chain, transparent, end-to-end verifiable, and censorship resistant, which they are not if they use an off-chain voting solution. Thus, they're not DAOs.
Yeah. And in some ways that actually presents a huge opportunity for those of us building things in the world of DAOs, is that there are a lot of people who maybe think of themselves as a DAO, want to be a DAO, plan on being a DAO, but maybe are not all the way there yet because they're not on chain. Maybe that's actually a market for all of us to go after, is those quote unquote DAOs that are doing everything off chain.
Totally. And I think Snapshot agrees with you, Adam. I think Snapshot agrees. Like, they wouldn't build this if they didn't think the future was on chain. Like, right? So they're the ones actually screaming that to the world, which is great.
Yeah, because I think in case anyone doesn't know, who's listening, I think a lot of these off-chain DAOs, and I'm part of some of them, right? It's just such an easy thing to do. I think a lot of us get trapped into doing it. Is we do a snapshot vote, which is again off-chain. It is cryptographic. Theoretically, can be verified independently if you have, you can verify that a vote was really voted on by the address that submitted the vote. What you cannot verify is the platform has all the data, or that is always available, et cetera. But a lot of people are using Snapshot not just as a signal before doing an on-chain vote. They do Snapshot as their vote, and then a multi-sig or a person acts on behalf of the organization. And I think that's why, whether it's Lutz or myself or probably Jessica, doesn't always see these as complete or real DAOs is that you're removing a massive amount of autonomy and decentralization by relying on a person or a small group of people to execute on the wishes of the DAO, which were even communicated on a platform that does not have the same security guarantees as a blockchain. But a lot of people do it.
Totally.
Do you want to
But
weigh in here?
let's not give them an excuse. Let's build this on-chain voting that's gasless, that's flexible. Let's get there and ensure that, you know, like we get them off that. Let's do our best.
Yeah, for sure. Let's do it. Jessica, do you want to weigh in here as well?
I was just going to point out on that front, and just speaking of competitors, et cetera, like it's really all hands on deck to build these solutions and to find solutions to get people to govern with all of the values that Anthony mentioned, like transparency, end-to-end verifiability, censorship resistance, et cetera. That said, it is a challenge. And you mentioned progressive decentralization and taking steps forwards. You know, there is some validity to having different stages in governance where you have a vote and then that vote gets approved or ratified and then an action gets taken, or that a proposal gets passed and there's a vote to veto, et cetera. So, you know, there is some validity to having these different stages to a governance process. And that's also part of what we're working on, is to bring more of that kind of modularity of these different stages. Like you mentioned, having a vote and then having a multi-sig ratify, for instance, being an example of that. Giving organizations more options and giving projects more options on putting different stages together to make decisions and pass proposals. The important thing is that it's transparent and that people understand that that's what's going on and it's not being misrepresented as something else, and that you're clear about being on a journey and you're clear on the steps you need to take towards decentralization, the trade-offs you need to make at any stage. With the stage at which the industry and the technology is at, we don't really have a choice to make trade-offs if we want to keep building in a way that's like effective and secure and that's sustainable for the time being. So I think we all need to give ourselves and each other grace for the steps we need to take, but be as transparent as we can as we build it, and kind of be all hands on deck to move the ball forward and to bring as much of this on chain as we can to make it as robust and as resilient as we can, as fast as we can as well, obviously.
Yeah. So I want to dig a little bit more into one of the things you brought up, which is this kind of multi-stage or multi-body governance, maybe one way of calling it, because it's a trend that I've been seeing in the DAO space. And I think you guys are building these features because I think you're seeing the same trend, but I want you to confirm that for me, which is, you know, I think some of the early DAOs, a lot of the early DAOs said, we're going to throw out everything from the old world of organizations, and we're only going to do things in a pure, direct, democratic way. Everyone is going to vote on everything and nothing else is going to happen. I think what a lot of DAOs are realizing is there's actually value in a lot of circumstances to having some teams, groups, call them managers, call them a security council, call them a veto board, call them something else, but there can be value in electing or having smaller groups of people that do have special rights and responsibilities in organizations. And so whether you build that in, again, as a group that has a veto, or a group that brings the proposals to the table, or a group that kind of just validates that transactions or actions are valid for the DAO, I think a lot of DAOs are going back and saying, maybe that's okay. Maybe we should elect a group of 7 people or 9 people to take on a special role in the organization. And I think you guys have built that type of capability into OSX, is the ability to easily add these additional groups that have some special power or special role in the organization. Is that right?
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's a viable option. I think at the end of the day, like decentralization is a means to an end, not the end itself. So like let's forget about the term DAO right now. Like you have tons of projects and they need to reach a goal. Some of them should be DAOs, some of them shouldn't be DAOs. It just depends. I always use Lido as the best example of like what needs to, like, that needs to be a very decentralized DAO. And that's why they just have binding on-chain execution. Like they are a true DAO in that sense, right? And they're of course a Gen 1, Gen 2 DAO, like back Aragon OS, you know, back in the day. And those were the truest forms of what we called DAOs back then, right? And so they need that because they cannot afford to be captured. They cannot afford to have these types of problems because $30 to $36 billion is governed on those contracts, right? So they need to be censorship resistant and anti-capture, unstoppable, right? So some projects don't. Like some projects are in their earliest phases. They're actually like still in the startup phase. They haven't reached product market fit yet. And they need to move more quickly, and decentralized decision making can be challenging sometimes in those circumstances. And so they decide to, use different mechanisms. Like, we're working with, Polygon or some other projects where only a certain council can put up a proposal, but then token holders can veto. This gives token holders like some hard on-chain rights to secure their funds and exit if they need to. But it's, governance overhead minimized in that, you only have this council who can actually put that vote on chain. So it's safe for them in this time as they are an organization, right? So I think that at the end of the day, we need to, as Aragon, although we love these pure DAOs, of course, just, from like a very poetic sense, we need to give optionality. And that's why our new product line in OSX was designed for this, has multi-body, multi-process governance. You can have different types of proposals that go up, and you can have different bodies governing each different type of proposal. So if you want a security, if you need a protocol upgrade and you're governing the permissions of your protocol, these people should be, it should be a different flow. You have a security council maybe at first, and you eventually remove that if you want to, and your DAO is ready, right? So I do agree with you. I think this is the only way. This is how, things are governed. This is how organizations operate in the real world. It's like the people who have the context and the expertise in that specific vertical should have their mind focused on that and not everything else. And that process might be governed differently than any other process. Like the process for at like the CDC when dealing with like different types of diseases, and the scientists there, is a different process than the people who need to take the money in and out of the bank account to pay those people, right? And the same goes for DAOs, right? So I definitely think that kind of flexibility is what we're bringing to the table quite soon, and it's a requirement, I think.
That's a great analogy. What about something I hear brought up still quite often by people interested in DAOs is the idea of rage quitting, which for the audience, if they don't know, the idea with a rage quit, which I think was originally built, although if the credit needs to go elsewhere, I apologize, but I think it was originally built by the Moloch DAO team, which is the DAO House front end. And in that framework, there's an option for your DAO to have something called rage quit, where once a proposal passes, everyone has a period of, like, let's say a couple of days, it can be anything you want, to actually leave the DAO and take your share of the DAO's on-chain assets with you when you leave. So it basically allows anyone to leave at any time with their share of the organization's assets if they don't like a decision that was recently made. What do you guys think about rage quitting? Have you built that into the tool? Is it even something you're considering? Are you against it? Are you neutral towards it?
I think a DAO that wants to have rage quit can definitely install rage quit. Moloch were the first. I think it would just have to be a plugin on OSX. So if there's a DAO out there who wants rage quit, they can come in, they can build rage quit, or I like to call it friendly exit. And they can install
Nice.
that and they can use it. And I think it's definitely a viable option for DAOs. I think some people believe that a DAO isn't a DAO without rage quit, right? They get to an extreme level there, which is really interesting. But we've also seen that rage quit can also be, unfortunately, gamed as well, which is something that we saw announced, where people continue the process over and over. And this can actually hurt a DAO and its long-term mission, because you don't know as a DAO what assets you have for how long, for when to achieve your goal. So it can also create complexity. So I think it just depends on the DAO and your goals. And if they want it on Aragon, come on over, knock on our door, and maybe we'll help you build it as a plugin.
Awesome. Love it. I'm going to keep going with the news, because we are digging into the real issues and some of the things I would ask you later in the interview anyways. So I'm going to keep going with the news, and we'll still save some time at the end for a couple traditional interview questions. The next story of the week, actually, speaking of competitors, relates to a competitor of MyDAO's. And the headline is, this is actually from the Nouns DAO blog. And the headline of their article is "Exploring a New Legal Framework for Nouns DAO, the Wyoming DUNA." So I'm not sure if we've talked about this on the show before, but there is an exciting new law that passed in Wyoming several months ago, creating something called a DUNA, which similar to what we've done with DAO LLCs that take the LLC and build upon them, the DUNA takes something called a UNA, which was a legal entity of sorts, and builds on it to create the decentralized UNA, or the DUNA. And this article is actually about the Nouns DAO. And I think I've talked about Nouns a lot on the show. It's certainly a leading DAO. They built their own DAO framework, which they and smart contracts, which they've now made available to others through Nouns Builder. I think I've probably talked on the show about Nouns Builder, which is a DAO, about Purple, which is a DAO on Nouns Builder. And the original Nouns DAO has decided to move from their Cayman structure, which I think is really smart. I probably talk a lot on the show about why I don't like Cayman foundations, because then you have an independent board of directors for your DAO. And I think, well, we were just talking about how that can be okay if that's what you want, if you want to have a board or something like it. A lot of DAOs don't want to be forced to have a board. So they're looking at moving to a Wyoming Duna. And, similar to what you guys were saying, mostly I'm excited. I want to see more innovation in the space. Every legal entity solution that comes out is going to have different characteristics. It's going to be right for different projects for different reasons. At the same time, it was nice for a while, being one of the only legal entities in the world for DAOs, and now seeing more emerge, it does create just maybe a fire, under my DAO for us to continue innovating and make sure that we continue differentiating. But it will be exciting to see what Nouns decides. We've been trying to get in on that conversation and make sure that they consider the DAO LLC as well. But I think from the beginning, they've been pretty excited about trying out this new legal entity in Wyoming, the Duna, and will be fun to follow what happens here. So, you guys want to weigh in on this article at all?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, in a similar way that DAOs need to plan for their adaptability and their evolution on the technical front to be able to adapt and evolve their contracts and their governance models, I feel like the same applies from a legal perspective. And everybody, that's participating in the space, in DAOs, et cetera, has a different kind of risk level, because when you're building something that's revolutionary, you're building something that's new and that doesn't exist. So like by definition, you won't have clarity on how it fits in like your current kind of societal construct or your current legal construct. And I think it's interesting that they're considering to evolve their legal structure as their DAO evolves and as the community evolves to meet the needs of where they're currently at. And a couple of things that I caught onto that they mentioned was that the Duna helps them kind of adapt more to what's happening on chain, or like the on-chain kind of structure of the DAO, not having these hierarchies, et cetera, that you need to have in other kind of more traditional legal structures. So that's always interesting when a solution can map back to what's happening on chain, and having what's happening on chain be your anchor. Obviously, there are a lot of trade-offs, things like KYC, which people tend to be kind of hesitant about, or kind of weigh in against paying taxes to a jurisdiction, et cetera. But depending on the community members, depending on what the activities are, which they've noted is like quite US centric, it can make sense to give everyone clarity of like, this is where the DAO lives. This is where most of the activity is, or where we feel most of the activity is. So it makes sense for us to be there. So I just feel like leaving some flexibility to be able to adapt your legal structure to what's happening, one, on your on-chain deployment, two, in like kind of the circumstances of how your community is growing and evolving, what activities are happening, what your membership is like. It's good to kind of triangulate that and to find the best solution at any given time. We're all going to need kind of the patience and the agility to navigate the legal structures as the regulatory landscape evolves, and as these different innovative solutions pop up in different jurisdictions.
Yeah. And one of the things I'm hearing a lot when it comes to Noun's decision, and you brought this up, is the connection to the United States, which it's interesting. You talk to some people and they say, well, obviously, I don't want to be connected to the US in any way. I'm not going to touch a legal entity in the United States. We're going to try to avoid the United States. Of course, I'm going offshore. And then in this situation, you have people actually saying, oh, we actually want to be in the United States. We think it gives us legitimacy. We don't mind paying the United States high taxes on corporations. We want to pay our taxes. We don't want to use an offshore nonprofit structure. And so, whether it's that or whether it's other elements of legal structures, often it's just a matter of preference and opinion, which, maybe is true for the tech stack as well.
Yeah, there's just no one size fits all for any one project, for any one community, and also just for one project at a certain given time in its journey and in its evolution. So I feel like as long as different kind of options are explored and that the communities prioritize the values that they care the most about and are clear and think through the trade-offs that they're willing to make at any given time, at this point we're always going to need to make trade-off, whether that's
Yeah.
taking on a ton of legal risk and uncertainty, or whether that is making certain trade-offs and sacrifices to have a bit more stability and certainty or clarity on what your processes look like and what the expectations look like and what risk you're carrying as an individual, like participating in these novel forms of technologies. It's kind of to each their own, as this is all evolving. I just don't feel like there's one clear
Yep,
answer or
for sure.
blanket answer.
Yep. All right, we'll do one more news story before we turn to a brief interview with the two of you. This is actually a cast from Farcaster from Vakdoni. And the cast is Votecaster is the first governance platform for Farcaster first DAOs and now has liquid delegation. We're rolling out this new feature to make governance easier for DAOs, fan clubs, and on-chain organizations. Now, I don't want to necessarily focus on the delegation component, but what's interesting to me about this project Votecaster is that they are starting with a social tool or platform, Farcaster, right? This Web3 social network, and saying, we're going to build DAOs into Farcaster. To me, it strikes me as in some ways opposite from something like Aragon or even Snapshot, which says we're going to build the technology infrastructure for DAOs, and then they can go figure out the social side of it separately or later. Now, you can tell me if you think that's a fair characterization or not, but I'm curious, how do you look at the social side, the collaboration side, the messaging, the communication side of DAOs? Is that something that Aragon is also trying to solve or going to try to solve or does help try to solve? Or is that a separate issue that, yeah, you need your tech stack, you need OSX, but then you got to go figure out how you actually socialize and communicate with the other members of your organization?
Yeah, so they're definitely separate things. There's no question. They do overlap in some regards because in order often to make good decisions, to govern something, you need to have, you often, but not always, need to have this sort of like ability to communicate well. Problem is we can't do it all. So we at Aragon focus on securing, right, your protocol and governance, your protocol and your assets, whatever needs to be secured. Actually, it could be information, it could be data, whatever needs to be secured on chain. That's what we do, and that's why we have to start from that fundamentally. We can't go and start from the social side because what we're doing is we're securing something. So like $36 billion is secured on Aragon OS, right? We're now heading into the billions that is secured on OSX. And that's through protocols, code, etc. Right? And there's a really cool project that's launching DAOs for information soon. That'll be really cool, like a decentralized Wikipedia or social graph, right? So now we can start to govern and secure information and data. So that's what we focus on. Vakdoni is actually a partner of Aragon. They were purchased by Aragon in 2021. And recently they spun out. They're flying on their own, let's say, but they have a lot of experience in voting. They originated out of the 2017 referendum in Catalonia. The team is primarily Catalan, and in which they thought that democracy was not properly upheld in that vote to separate from Spain. And they started building on a proof of authority tendermint blockchain, the ability for people not with tokens, not in Web3, but in Web2, to be able to vote on the blockchain, to have transparent, end-to-end verifiable votes, right? And that's where they started from. And FC Barcelona have used them for their votes, and some towns in Spain. Super, super cool, right? And so they're focusing on that social aspect through Farcaster, which is really great because they're not securing, and that's not their goal, is to secure things, right? They're really focusing on ensuring that people can engage and vote and have these transparent elections or voting processes. And that's what they're focused on. And so that's super, super cool. And that's why it fits perfectly. Like Farcaster, is great. There are great communities there. There are people that need to make decisions. And Vakdoni are the leader on Farcaster and ensuring that people can make these decisions transparently and with censorship resistance in mind, to do what they need to do. We more focus on the secure aspect of that.
Cool. Awesome. All right. So that does it for the Just DAO It news report. I'm going to do a quick ad for MyDAO, and then we will turn to a brief interview with our guests. So the ad for MyDAO is just a reminder that MyDAO provides a legal entity solution for DAOs and Web3 out of the Marshall Islands. We have a network of lawyers and service providers all over the world that work with DAOs and Web3, and we can get people connected with those at no cost, whether you're working with us or not. If you are a lawyer or a corporate service provider of any kind that's interested in serving DAOs and Marshall Islands DAOs, please get in touch to be added to our network. All right, so let's just take a one step back, and then we'll take a couple more steps forward here before we close the interview in the next half hour. So I want to ask you each about your journey in Web3 and DAOs. So maybe Jessica, we could start with you. How did you go? How did you get to where you are today? What's your journey that got you into Web3 and DAOs in the first place?
Yes, very good question. I actually come from just caring deeply about democratizing access to the public sphere. And that journey for me started working at Facebook and Instagram at the time in the public policy team. And what really motivated me about working there was to democratize access to voice and speech in a way that hadn't been done before, where everybody had a platform, everybody had a mic. Also, democratizing access to economic opportunities for small businesses to reach their customers, democratizing access to organization too, like through groups, et cetera, and to connecting with others. And so that's how that journey started. But I also came across the limits to centralized entities and to having all of that technology infrastructure being owned and maintained on centralized servers. And I was at Facebook during some pretty contentious political times with like the Cambridge Analytica scandal and also at the beginning of the pandemic. And you just kind of see the limits that exist when you have that big of a platform at that big of a scale that's managed by a centralized entity, and that's managed that the infrastructure is like has a choke point basically. You can hold a gun to somebody's head and try to get XYZ, result or outcome that you want. Like there's a centralized pressure point that's really vulnerable that you can't really get rid of because of how it structurally kind of exists. So after taking some time off, I was looking into crypto and Ethereum. And when I came across Aragon, specifically, I just thought, wow, like DAOs and Aragon are the solution to this, because you just slide a DAO under something at scale like Facebook that's democratizing access, where people actually own the underlying infrastructure and can take decisions in a way that's sovereign, in a way that's capture and censorship resistant. I was like, oh, that's the solution. So I joined Aragon, and I have been here since working on this challenge. Which is a long road, but that's really what motivated me to get into Web3. And it was a pretty kind of direct journey into on-chain governance to really solve like these structural issues around really kind of powerful technology and what we need to do to make it more resilient and distributed in terms of the way that it's governed.
Awesome. I want to ask you one follow-up question. So I've always used Facebook as an example. If someone asks me, someone who doesn't know anything about DAOs or Web3 asks me what a DAO is, I'll say, well, think about Facebook. There's basically one guy in charge of how Facebook works, right? This platform that influences our elections, everything about our lives. If he decides he wants to promote a certain type of item in the feed or a certain type of news or a certain type of politics, he gets to do it. Imagine if instead everyone who used Facebook got to vote and decide on the newsfeed algorithm or on the policies for the network. Wouldn't that be a better world? But to play devil's advocate for a second, my question to you is, are the users of Facebook actually going to make a better decision about how Facebook works than Mark Zuckerberg? Or maybe they won't, well, maybe they won't, but it's the right thing to do philosophically anyways, for people to be in charge of the places that we live and operate. Or is it both? Is it actually the right thing to do? And somehow with the right technology and process, the users of Facebook can actually make better decisions about what Facebook should be than Mark Zuckerberg can.
Also very, very good, challenging question, actually. Um, I think these decisions are really challenging at scale. So if you ask the entire user base, like a 3 billion user kind of base, to make decisions on what is right and wrong, what should be said and what shouldn't be said, you'll never get anywhere, because people don't agree. And localized experiences are so different around the world. So I feel like it's more about giving people more kind of sovereignty and more weight in the decisions that affect them and their communities. So part of that was built in terms of the processes around content moderation in at platforms like Facebook, where you take this into account and you do have relationships with all these communities around the world that give you feedback that you collect and you kind of build into these policies. But when you look at DAO technology and being able to give people technology to self-organize, and give them ownership and give them permission around the spaces that they exist in, it's like maybe that's tricky at scale when you're looking at a scale of billions of people. But I think what this technology creates is the opportunity to maybe have smaller pockets, like if you look at Farcaster channels, etc., where then smaller communities can make decisions for themselves, set the parameters that they want, set the permissions that they want, and make decisions that apply to them. So I feel like the power is really in giving individuals and communities more agency in that way, maybe not necessarily at a scale of billions. It's like the bigger the scale is, the more narrow the decisions need to be, or the smaller the community is, the broader the decisions that impact them can be.
I love that. It reminds me of, I heard recently, and I can't remember where, there was this European, maybe his name was de Tocqueville, I could be wrong, who observed in the 1800s the United States to try to figure out how we did democracy so well. And I know maybe debatable, but I'm a big fan of democracy and how it's gone in the United States so far. But he was trying to figure out how do Americans do it? Like in Europe, like they had voter apathy. No one wanted to participate in democracy. It didn't seem like it was going well. And he observed that we do democracy in every aspect of our daily lives. In school, we have student councils. In clubs and nonprofits, we have boards and presidents, and people get elected, and we do voting all the time. Even if a group of people wants to go out and hang out at a bar, they might do a quick little vote on, where does everyone prefer to go. So you observe that we were doing it in our daily lives. And I think that it's something that we may be losing, because in these online spaces like Facebook, there is no voting. There is no governance. You join a group and the group works the way that either Mark Zuckerberg wants or the group moderator wants. Same thing on Reddit. There was a moderator who was the person who created the channel, and that person gets to decide forever how things happen. I hope, and I wonder if you agree, that as we build governance back into the tools we use in our daily lives, even things that we use to socialize, we actually can exercise that muscle again of democracy, and that it will help us improve how we do democracy again, even at the scale of countries and governments.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think at the end of the day, also like the question of whether the decision is made better or worse is always going to be difficult to answer, right? Sort of a flip of the coin sometimes. But at the very least, if people have hard power, they can stop coercion, corruption, or these types of things. So, in the case of, a small group of people being dictated by a government to change the feed or the algorithm, or, the famous algorithm or whatnot. Well, if the people have the hard power over that, that's much more difficult to do, right? It's more difficult to censor. It's more difficult to achieve these things. So I think you can at least put checks and balances in place. I think that's where like optimistic governance with these veto methodologies really empowers people to have hard power over decisions, but they can still allow people to, really smart and intelligent people to make decisions. And if they don't like it, they can eventually put a stop to it. So, the ownership sort of changes and the checks and balances come into place. I think we need a lot of checks and balances. But I agree with what you're saying. Like, good decision making is really important, and decentralized decision making can often reduce risk. And it's something we see here in Switzerland, where I live all the time, because we directly vote often. 4 times a year, we directly vote on certain decisions. We have direct democracy. So, totally agree with what you're saying.
Awesome. So Lutz, tell us a bit about your background. How did you get into Web3 and DAOs in the first place?
Yeah, sure. My story, I don't think it's as interesting as Jessica's, but yeah, I mean, I was working in the education sector, but in fundraising. So I was leading the largest sort of fundraise for students coming to Switzerland from external countries. So I got to travel a lot, and I've been to 60, 70 countries traveling for that job, trying to bring the best and brightest students to Switzerland on full scholarships, etc. And I got to meet with amazing families in that process and try and redistribute money from the wealthiest people in the world, and I really mean the wealthiest, to some of the best and most deserving students who wouldn't be able to afford to go to these types of places. And so it was in that process that I really began to realize that especially in the fundraising world, a lot more transparency would go a very, very long way. And probably more decentralized decision making could also go a long way too. And so then I just started sort of falling down the rabbit hole, as many people do. I actually joined Buckdoni, funny enough,
Mm,
originally, which had just been purchased by Aragon. So I was originally focusing
mm,
on getting like the Swiss government, or towns or cities or large organizations or cooperatives to start using the blockchain to vote on. And then I got wrapped up into Aragon. I transitioned over to Aragon and then sort of just kept marching as the Pied Piper for Aragon and governance in general. And that's where I got today. And here we are 3 years later.
awesome. Love it. All right. We're going to do a couple questions about the state of DAOs today and where we're going or where we should be going before we close. So let me just ask each of you, and think about it from the perspective of someone starting a DAO today. So if you're newer to the DAO space, maybe you've been in the space for a few months, doing your research, maybe trying to join a DAO or two, and now you're thinking, okay, I'm going to start a DAO, right? What would you tell that person in terms of what are DAOs doing right today that they should learn from existing DAOs and do things in a similar manner? And what are DAOs doing wrong today? What's something that we've made mistakes in the space that this new DAO founder should learn from?
Jess, why don't you go first?
I guess I'll answer it with one thought of what's right and wrong. And I feel like not over committing to one governance model or one trajectory as a be all end all at this stage, I think can go a long way in building adaptability into the process. So whether that's done directly or indirectly, I do think that the organizations that and the DAOs that have this kind of agility have been navigating probably better than those that don't have agility or that kind of lock themselves in or aren't open to change, etc. I do feel that what we can learn from what has worked is this ability to adapt and evolve over time and to keep making steps forward in terms of the progress and to meet the needs of your community and the needs of your project at any point in time in order to take the next step forward. And I think the wisdom that can come from the past years of experimentation is that there will continue to be breakthroughs. There will continue to be really innovative, interesting models that come out. And so it's just, I think, wise to build this ability into your plans and into your assumptions that these novel forms of governance are going to pop up like they have in the past. And like we've seen some successful DAOs adopt, that'll be a good fit and an interesting choice for different projects. So I feel like it's kind of the two-sided coin of not being too stuck into thinking that you have the kind of be all and all of the successful path forward and leaving the space for adaptability into your plans and this assumption that the space is growing and evolving really fast and that new models and new solutions are going to keep evolving and it's one step in front of the other. So making kind of most of your decisions with that mindset, whether that's your tech stack or whether that's legally the different decisions you're making.
I love that. It makes me think about how a lot of DAOs have like a constitution or some other kind of like core document. And so, which I think can be really valuable. And I've talked on this show about why it can be extremely valuable because if you have especially a very permissionless way of participating in the system that people can just come in and out really easily, it's really important to make sure people are on the same page about some core issues. and that they know, like, what is this DAO for? How does it work? What are maybe our core values or operating principles, to keep everyone aligned? But perhaps if you're going to do that, you need to make sure to think about, how can the Constitution be updated over time? Do we set a culture of updating it and regularly reviewing it? And maybe that's one way that DAOs can try to remain flexible in a way that you're describing. What about you, Lutz?
Yeah, I think that's really great what Jess said, and I think it's true. Yeah, I think the most important thing that people, I think, get wrong is they don't follow their North Star. Why are you doing what you're doing is, I think, what people lose all the time. Why are you launching a DAO? What are you trying to achieve? And thus designing it properly to focus on achieving that goal. And people just ignore that all the time. They just launch a DAO, they launch a token. But what are you trying to be achieved, and being honest about that, I think, is super important. And then aligning people around that. I think even better than a constitution, although I think, constitution can be very beneficial, especially like a very concise one, to be honest, is, what are your mission? What's your mission? What's your vision, and what are your values? And following these three things, staying aligned to that, I think is super important. And I think you might not even need a constitution if you are continuously aligned on what your mission, vision, values are, and the decisions you make as a DAO follow that. Because the minute you aren't true to what you're trying to achieve is when you start to get off balance, which is, I think, where a lot of DAOs get off balance. Overextending on certain aspects, whether that be decentralization, trust minimization, not following token liquidity properly. As you said, like, how permissionless do you want contributors to be? All of these things should be aligned around what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to achieve launching a great grants program, that's very different than building a product. And you need to design your DAO around what you're trying to get at, right? And so, like, we know that there are excellent methodologies towards building a great product. Well, you need to design your DAO to ensure that it's not hindered from reaching that goal, and it actually helps you reach that goal, if you're building that product or whatever else you might be doing. So for me, that's probably the most important thing that almost everybody gets wrong, not just in DAOs, but in life itself. And so I think that's important. And I think we get caught up way too often in the glitz and glam of our space and how fast it moves and what the next narrative is. And really, we need to be more focused on trying to achieve our goals and designing everything around that. And that leads into what Jessica said, is you build to be adaptable so that you can adjust on your way to reaching there, which is super important. And we've finally gotten the technology now. And it's something we've worked on for the last few years at Aragon, where you can finally start to do that. You finally have the flexibility and the adaptability to actually do that, where you never had this before. Old DAOs sadly never had this. On Aragon, the original Aragon, and on Open Zeppelin, you have no flexibility. Like, you launch your DAO and you're stuck in it for years, and you can see that by the discussion we had with Governor, Aragon, all these things before, Compound. And, so we're finally getting there, and it's really, really exciting. Time for us in the DAO space and Web3, and we'll definitely get there.
Awesome. Either of you have any favorite or otherwise DAOs that you recommend people check out if they're new to the space? DAOs that maybe they could learn from, a effective DAO that's operating well, that people could, learn from experiencing?
For me, go find a DAO that that interests you, like, not the DAO itself, but what it's doing, what it's trying to achieve, as I mentioned earlier, right? And then go look at a DAO that seems to be doing a great job, I would say, in that specific vertical, because not two DAOs are the same. You can't compare, there's a proposal up in Optimism right now to decentralize further, and how can they compare themselves truly to a Lido or a Maker or an Aave, who've been extremely successful DAOs, but are different. They're DeFi, they're DeFi protocols, So I would say those two things are really important. There aren't too many DAOs that are like truly decentralized, trust minimized, but for now that's okay as we continue to progress in that direction. Just find what you're interested in, and I think if you follow what you're interested in, you'll have a good time and you'll enjoy it, and thus you'll be more impactful.
Yeah, I would say something very similar. I think maybe an extra nuance to add is maybe look at DAOs that have been around for some time. So if you do look at Alido and Aave and Maker, etc., seeing how these DAOs have lasted the test of time, at least in crypto for the short time we've been around, and seeing how they've managed to kind of sustain that success in their community and how the governance works. That's one approach and one aspect to study. Is DAOs that are more kind of established in the space and successful. And the other approach could be look at novel, DAOs that are popping up and new forms of governance. And something like Nouns DAO can be interesting, where it's a new form of governance that you can explore kind of at the frontier. So I think kind of looking at those two angles could be like an interesting contrast, especially to get ideas, and then experimenting yourself if you have, if you want to participate directly in an existing DAO or create a DAO of your own. That's also a really great way to learn and get oriented.
Yep.
And now it's easy to spin up a DAO on chain for anyone that doesn't know how to code, et cetera, and to start just playing around and experimenting with the technology.
For sure. Yeah. And, people could check out websites like DAObase.ai or DeFi Llama, where you can look at protocols or DAOs and sort them either by assets or by number of proposals that have been passed recently, and browse through them. And to your point, look for one that you think you may be able to get passionate about. It's like if you were looking for a nonprofit to volunteer for or a company to work for, I think you'd want to look at, well, what does the nonprofit do? What does the company do? What is the community interested in? Not just let me find a community that operates effectively, but like, let me find a community of like-minded people that I would enjoy being a part of. And so I think, you can apply a similar principle to DAOs as you guys are suggesting. Let's just close with first of all, I think we talked a lot about Aragon and OSX earlier, but if either of you wants to share more or a summary of what you're building, how to check it out, how to learn more, please do. And then also just where can people find you on the web or on social media? Lutz, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. You could find both of us on Twitter. That's probably where we spend most of our DevCon, hosting a few events. So feel free to reach out. If you are anybody working in Web3 or launching a project in Web3, you think you want to tokenize or not, feel free to come to Aragon or www.aragon.org, take a look at what we're building. Obviously, we enable anybody to build the DAO of their dreams. So if you're a developer and you want to build a highly custom DAO, we can help you with that. If you just need to click no code and launch a DAO in 10 minutes, we can also help you with that. Govern and secure all your assets on chain. We've got a lot of great things coming from, as we mentioned, storage proofs, multi-chain voting, multi-body governance. Like there's a lot going on. And our goal is to empower you to govern and secure your assets and protocol fully on chain. So yeah, www.aragon.org. Find us on Twitter. I'm Lutz on Twitter or on Farcaster. And yeah, ping us for anything.
Absolutely. How about you, Jessica?
I am Hey Jessica Smith on Twitter and across platforms, actually, and messaging apps. So please feel free to reach out. And like Anthony said, come to our website to learn more about what we're building.
Awesome. And as for myself, I'm 0xThriller on Twitter and The Thriller on Farcaster. My DAO is at MyDAODS, MIDAODS on Twitter or MyDAO.org. We will be at MCon this weekend. We'll be at Permissionless. We'll be at Island DAO if anyone's going to Island DAO. So please reach out and come say hello. As always, this is never tax or legal or financial advice. As for educational and entertainment purposes only, MyDAO provides legal entity solutions for DAOs based out of the Marshall Islands, and we have a network of lawyers and partners who can help you out with all of your professional advisory needs. Again, Lutz and Jessica from Aragon, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, everybody. See you around.
Yep, sounds good. Finally, for the audience, are you thinking about starting a DAO? Just DAO it.